Today we're going to learn how to group some data together that you have in your database and run some aggregate functions so that we can do some statistics on our data. So SQL has a statement group by, which allows you to group rows by a certain column that is similar or a set of columns that are similar. And when we group by, we group some rows by a certain category or a certain column, then we can say, okay, now that I've grouped like all my rows, for example, let's say I have a set of employees and I want to know how many people work in the same department. So I can group my data by employee and then I can count. I can see how many employees are in that department, or what's the maximum salary in a department, or what's the sum of all the salaries that I can pay. I have to pay for people in a certain department. So the group by, usually you don't use it alone, but you use it with one of those aggregate functions. So we're going to learn how to use the group by today. And the way you do it is that you put the group by under the where. So you select your columns from a table that match a certain condition. And then once you have those rows that you've selected that match a certain condition, you can group them. And then you can also order them. So the group by comes with the order by. So let's look at an example here. I want to group my customers by customer ID. So what I can do is I can say, okay, I want you to show me the customer IDs from the customer order table, and I want you to group them by customer ID. So it's going to go through all the customers, put all the customers that have the same customer ID in kind of like a bubble together or a pot together, and then it's going to show you all the customer IDs that are there. This is going to give you exactly the same as saying select the distinct customer IDs from customer order. Let's try that out. Seeing group by without the aggregate functions doesn't seem meaningful, but let's try that out so we can see how it works. So what I did was I made sure that I ran my sample SQL that was at the beginning of the course that we did. So I've dropped all the tables, I've recreated all my tables and inserted all the data. So I did that before this video. And now I just want to see, some of the information. So if I just say select star from customer order, this is going to show me all the customers and their orders. Okay, so let's kind of remind ourselves what this table had. So this table had, for the customers, an order ID, that was the primary key. And then for every order, the customer, what they ordered, and when they placed that order. Now, as you can see, if I look at this table and I say order by customer ID, I will be able to see all the customers that placed an order. So I see that customer 1 didn't place any order. Customer 2 placed a couple, customer 3 a couple, customer 5, no customer 4. So it's showing me the customers. But what I want to do is I want to see which customers actually, which customers ordered so that I can see which ones maybe didn't order later. So here I'm just interested in seeing the customer ID. Okay, so let's just put it all on different lines. So I'm interested in the customer IDs. But again, if I do that, it's going to show me all of them and I have duplicates. So what we learned before was we can use the word distinct. So if I say distinct, it's going to show me only the customer IDs, the distinct ones. So this is a little better because I don't really want to know how many each one ordered for now. So instead of writing it this way, what I could say is I want you to select the customer ID. The column that I'm interested in looking at is the customer ID from the customer order table. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to group the data by customer ID. So I want you to go and then order by customer ID again. What I want it to do is I want it to go through all the customer IDs in customer order, and any order that had the same customer ID, it's going to put it in the same box. So let's see what that's going to look like. let's just put this to the side and let's go back and look at this query. So here it's going to look at the first row and say the customer ID is 3. So it's going to come and create a box for customer ID 3. And it's going to put row 1 in it. So row number 1 is there. And then it's going to come to the second row and say, okay, this is customer ID 5. So it's going to come to customer ID 5 and it's going to put row 2 in it. And then customer ID 6, we're going to have a box for customer ID 6 and it's going to have row 3 in it and so on. But I'm just going to jump and go until I hit row number, let's see, row number 13. Row number 13 and row number 6 both have customer ID 5. So row number 6 will come and be put in this box for customer ID 5. And row number 13 also will be put in that box. And so what I'm doing is I'm grouping all my rows by customer ID. If they have the same customer ID, they are going to be placed in the same box. And then once I have them in the same box, I'm going to run queries. So what I did here was after grouping them by customer ID, after grouping them by customer ID, I said, I want to see all those customer IDs. So it's going to come here and say, okay, what are the customer IDs that I have? I have 3, I have 5, I have 6, and so on. And so it shows me only those customer IDs. So this is how you use the group by. Now, one thing about the group by is that whatever you're selecting needs to match the customer, the group by. So I can't say, for example, I want you to show me the order ID. So if I try doing that, it says not a group by expression. It's not going to work. Whatever you're grouping by, you need to make sure that you are kind of selecting also. So those have to match. Otherwise, you're going to get this error message that says this is not a group by expression. So this is the general idea of the group by. Now, to use the group by, you really need to use it with an aggregate function. And so we're going to talk about count, average, and sum in today's lecture. So I'm going to start off with the count. And all of these, the way you do it is you say select, and then you put the function name like count or average or sum, and then you put the column that you're trying to count, or the column that you want to average, or the column that you want to add, and then you select your table and your conditions. Let's look at an example. Okay. So what I did also before this class was I inserted an extra row into my database. So if I just say, if I go to a table, let's say customer order, and I just say, I want you to count me how many rows there are, what we can do is say select count asterisk from customer order. So this will tell me how many rows are in this table. Now, if I want to count how many rows have a valid customer ID, have a customer ID that's not null, I can say count and then the column that I want to count. Let's run these two on our database. So here, if I just say select count of asterisk from customer order, it shows me that I have 50 rows. If I say, okay, oops. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that line into my database. And what I'm doing is I'm inserting a customer, an order into the customer order table that has has order ID 51. It doesn't have a customer ID and doesn't have a product. So basically an order that doesn't have a customer or a product that was ordered. So I'm adding this line, oops, let's see, let's copy it again. And before I run it, let's just run select count customer ID customer order. If I want to know how many rows actually have a customer ID, it's still 50. Now, once I add this line in, okay, now my table should have 51 rows because I just inserted the 51st order. If I say, count me how many rows are in this table, I will find that now I have 51 rows. But how many actually have a customer ID value? Only 50 will have it. Why? Because I don't have a customer ID for this one. Let's look at another table. Let's look at our employee table, for example. So my employee table has some employees that have manager ID as null. Okay, if I want to see exactly how many, I can say where manager ID is null. Let's see how many. And so I only have one that has a manager ID of null. So if I just go and I say, I want you to show me the count, how many rows are in employee, okay, it's going to show me all the rows that were there, 200. But if I say, I want you to count me how many rows have a valid manager ID, that's going to give me one less because I know that one of them is null. So it's not going to be counting that row. So it only gives me 199. So this is a general idea of how we can use the count function. You can count how many rows are in a table, or you can count how many rows have a valid value for a certain column in a table. So that's one use of the count. Now, how can we use the count with group ID, a group by? This is just another example. If I want to count how many unique customers placed an order, we can put the word distinct in there. Now, to use group by with count, what I can do is I can say, okay, first of all, I want to group my data by customer ID. And then I want you to count for me how many customer IDs we have. So here, what I'm doing is I'm going and I'm saying, I want you to show me the customer ID column, and I want you to show me the count of the customer ID. So because I'm using a group by, the first thing it's going to do is going to group my data by the customer ID. So first of all, I'm going to get those boxes that I've created. Now, what is it that I want to display after I got those boxes? I want a column that shows me the customer ID, and I want a column that tells me how many customer IDs are in each group. So what it does here is that it's showing me every customer ID, the count, how many rows, when it did the grouping by customer ID, how many rows had that same customer ID. Okay, so let's look at how, let's look at a query that might help us do that. So again, if I just say select star from customer, and I'm going to order by customer ID. Okay. So here I see that, and let's just take some notes. I see that customer ID 2 appears 4 times. Okay, and customer ID 3 appears 4, also 4 times. And customer ID 5, let's just scroll down a little to count them, appears 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So here we've taken 3 customers and we know how many orders they've placed. Now what we want to do is do this programmatically. So what I want to do, I want to see a table that tells me for every customer ID, the count of how many times this customer ID appeared. Where am I getting this from? I'm getting it from the customer order table. Now I need to group my data, so I'm going to group it by customer ID. In order for me to get a count, I need to do a group by. And so when I do that, I get that customer 2 placed 4 orders, customer 5 placed 9 orders, customer 3 placed 4 orders. So I'm getting those numbers that I want. And then you can use the order by, like I can say, I want you to order it by, customer ID is one way I could do it. Okay, that's one way I could do it, or I could order it by the count of customer ID. So if I want to see, which customer placed the most orders, I can do that also. So you can order even by the count column. Now, if you're grouping by a column, it has to match the count. So I can't say here group by order ID and count customer ID. It's going to tell me not a group by expression. So whatever you're grouping by is what you're counting, because that is what the group is, you know, based on. So you grouped your data based on customer ID into buckets. Each bucket has the same, all rows have the same customer ID, and then you're going and counting how many items are in that bucket. So this is how we can use the group by with the count. Okay. Here's just another example that we just did where we're ordering by that count so that we can see them ordered by count to see from us in ascending order.